The security guard slammed the door shut. No way out. I had the thumb drive with Mr. Abraham's real vitals, but Dr. Vance was already calling it a special procedure. The police in tactical gear weren't here to help. They were here to make sure he died quietly. My hands shook as I hit record again, this time on their faces. If I didn't get this out, we were all next. The janitor grabbed my arm. Bill, the only one I could trust. Back stairwell now. The hospital's perfect record wasn't just a lie. It was a death sentence, and I was the only one left who could prove it. The plastic casing of the defibrillator paddles bit into Sarah Johnson's palms, the cold grit of the textured grip grounding her as the world dissolved into a blur of sterile white tiles and screaming monitors. Mr. Abraham's chest rose in a jagged, mechanical jerk, a puppet pulled by electric strings, but the heart rate monitor continued its flat, piercing whistle. Sweat stung Sarah's eyes, blurring the sight of the 72-year-old man whose life was leaking out through the gaps in a broken system. She reached for the dial to increase the joules, her mind already calculating the exact 3-second window remaining before permanent brain damage set in. 1, 2. A heavy hand clamped around her forearm, the grip so tight it bruised the bone. "Let go of him, nurse," a voice rumbled, vibrating with a terrifying bored authority. Sarah wrenched her arm away, her knuckles rapping against the cold metal bedrail with a sharp crack. "He's into V-fib," she gasped, her voice echoing off the polished walls of room 402. "We have a window. Move." 2 security guards stepped into the frame of her vision, their heavy boots thudding rhythmically against the linoleum. The taller one, Miller, didn't reach for his holster. He simply stepped between Sarah and the dying man, a wall of navy blue polyester and muscle. His uniform smelled of stale coffee and industrial laundry soap, a domestic scent that felt obscene in the presence of death. He shoved his palms against Sarah's shoulders, a blunt force pushing her toward the door. "Step away from the patient, Johnson," Miller said. His eyes were flat, devoid of the panic that should accompany a flat line. "Policy changed this morning. Clean record protocols are in effect." "He's 72 years old," Sarah screamed, her heels skidding on the floor as she tried to plant her weight. "He has a daughter in the waiting room. Get out of my way." She tried to duck under Miller's arm, her fingers twitching for the adrenaline syringe on the crash cart. But the second guard grabbed her waist. He lifted her off her feet, her scrubs bunching under her armpits as she thrashed in the air. The flatline tone evolved into a mocking, continuous drone, a sound that vibrated through the floorboards and into the marrow of her bones. Miller watched the monitor, his face a mask of compliant indifference, while Mr. Abraham's skin faded from a sickly yellow to the color of wet ash. Sarah's sneaker caught the edge of the cart, sending a tray of gauze fluttering like white moths to the floor, marking the seconds she would never get back. The silence that followed the monitor's final note was heavier than the noise. The guards didn't move until the line on the screen was perfectly, irrevocably horizontal. Only then did Miller step aside, adjusting his belt with a rhythmic click-clack that made Sarah's stomach churn. She stood trembling, her breath coming in ragged hitches, counting the tiles between her and the bed. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 steps. She had been 4 steps away from saving a life, and the system had lengthened that distance to an infinity. The heavy double doors of the ICU swung open with a pneumatic hiss, admitting a gust of air that smelled of expensive cologne and ozone. Dr. Robert Vance walked in, his bespoke suit charcoal gray and perfectly pressed, looking more like a CEO than a surgeon. He didn't look at the body on the bed. He looked at the clipboard in his hand, his eyes scanning the data with predatory efficiency. "Attention, please," Vance said, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone that commanded the room. "We have a localized equipment malfunction in the East Wing. All senior staff are required in the surgical theater for a manual override of the oxygen flow. This is a priority 1 emergency." The nurses and residents, already frayed by the tension of the morning, scrambled toward the exit. Sarah stood her ground, her hand hovering over the bedside monitor. She knew the emergency was a ghost, a tactical distraction designed to clear the floor. Vance's eyes flicked to her, unblinking and cold, but he continued to usher the others out, his hand resting briefly on a young resident's shoulder in a gesture of false comfort. As the room emptied, Sarah moved with a silent, frantic precision. She didn't look at Vance's back. Instead, she leaned over the central monitor, her fingers dancing across the screen. She knew the hospital's main record would show Mr. Abraham died of natural causes at 4:15 a.m. But the local monitor, the one the guards had forgotten to wipe, still held the truth. She pulled a small silver thumb drive from her pocket, a cold piece of metal that felt like a stolen soul. She jammed it into the port. A small blue light began to blink, a rhythmic heartbeat of data. 10%, 40%, 80. The beauty of a clean record is the silence it provides, Sarah. Vance's voice drifted from the doorway, though he wasn't looking at her. He was straightening his silk tie, his fingers performing the triple tie tug that Sarah had learned to dread. A deep, expensive, necessary silence. The drive glowed solid blue. Done. Sarah snatched it, tucking it into the hidden pocket of her leggings just as Vance turned. She forced her face into a mask of grief-stricken exhaustion, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. I'm closing his eyes, Doctor," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Do it quickly," Vance replied, his smile never reaching his eyes. "The transport team is already in the bay. We have a schedule to maintain." Sarah hurried from the room, her mind racing. She needed a way out, but the main elevators were already being watched by Miller's team. She turned a corner and nearly collided with a mop bucket. The smell of industrial bleach hit her, sharp and stinging. "Down here, nurse," a low, gravelly voice hissed. Bill the janitor stood in the shadows of the service alcove, his stooped shoulders draped in a gray uniform that seemed to swallow the light. He didn't look at her. He looked at the floor, his hands gripped tight around the handle of his mop. Sarah didn't hesitate. She followed him into the narrow, dimly lit service corridor where the air was thick with the hum of hidden machinery. "The cameras don't see the laundry tracks," Bill whispered, his voice barely audible over the slosh thump of his bucket. "Follow the red pipes. They'll take you to the loading dock. Don't stop to count the doors, Sarah. Just run." "Bill, why are you helping me?" she asked, her hand pressing the thumb drive against her thigh. The old man finally looked up, and for a second, Sarah saw the ghost of a younger, braver man in his eyes. "I stayed silent 30 years ago," he said, his voice cracking. "The floors are soaked in blood that never washes out. Get that thing out of here. Make them see it." He shoved his cart in front of the main service entrance, creating a barrier of plastic and soap, and nodded toward the darkness. Sarah plunged into the labyrinth, the walls closing in as she navigated the narrow veins of the hospital. The heat from the steam pipes made her skin slick with sweat, and the smell of hot metal and wet fabric filled her lungs. She counted her steps out loud, a frantic, rhythmic prayer. 1, 2, 3, 60, 80. If she knew the dimensions, she couldn't get lost. She couldn't be erased. She reached a heavy steel door marked Loading Dock 4 and cracked it open just an inch. The cool night air of Connecticut hit her face, a shocking contrast to the stagnant heat of the basement. She stayed in the shadows, her eyes scanning the ambulance bay. A gurney was being wheeled out, covered in a heavy black shroud. But it wasn't the hospital's transport van waiting at the curb. It was a fleet of black SUVs, their engines idling with a low, predatory growl. Men in tactical vests, men wearing the silver stars of the local police department, stepped out to meet the gurney. They didn't speak. They moved with a synchronized, military precision, hoisting Mr. Abraham's body into the back of a van as if he were a crate of contraband. Sarah felt the world tilt. This wasn't just a hospital cover-up. The infection had spread to the marrow of the city. The police weren't there to investigate. They were the extraction crew. She clutched the thumb drive so hard the metal edges bit into her palm. She had the proof, but she was standing in the center of a web that spanned far beyond the white walls of St. Jude's. The drive home was a blur of suburban streetlights and rising paranoia. Sarah's apartment in the quiet outskirts of the city usually felt like a sanctuary, a place where the high ceilings and empty rooms offered a hollow kind of peace. Tonight, the perfectly manicured lawns of her neighbors looked like a graveyard of secrets, the synchronized oscillation of the lawn sprinklers sounding like the ticking of a countdown clock. She fumbled with her keys, her fingers numb. When she finally pushed the door open, the silence of the apartment felt heavy, pressurized. She didn't turn on the lights. She moved by the pale glow of the moon, her feet finding the familiar path to her bedroom. She stopped in the doorway. A draft was blowing through the room, smelling of damp earth and broken glass. Her eyes traced the jagged hole in her bedroom window, the shards of glass glittering on the carpet like spilled diamonds. Her dresser had been overturned, her medical journals shredded and scattered. But it was the bed that made her breath catch. Lying in the center of her white pillow was a single, obsidian black feather. It was a calling card, a silent, elegant threat that told her they had been here. They knew where she slept, and they could touch her whenever they chose. The clean record policy wasn't just about data. It was about the total erasure of dissent. Sarah backed away, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She couldn't stay here. Her home had been transformed into a trap, a cage with the door left wide open. She grabbed her laptop and her emergency kit, her mind already jumping to the only person she might be able to trust. Mark. He was safe. He was steady. He would know what to do with the numbers. They met at Miller's Pond Park, a dark expanse of water and skeletal trees 3 miles from the hospital. The air was frigid, the mist of Sarah's breath thick in the beam of her headlights. Mark was already there, leaning against his sedan, his face etched with a worry that made him look 10 years older. "Sarah, thank God," he said, reaching out to touch her arm. He spoke in that rising, questioning tone that usually comforted her, but tonight it felt like a lack of conviction. "You're okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "They killed him, Mark. Mr. Abraham. They let him go," she said, the words spilling out in a frantic rush. She pulled the thumb drive from her pocket. "I have the data, the real vitals. It shows they withheld the shock. It shows Vance gave the order." Mark didn't reach for the drive. He pulled his hand back, his fingers twitching. "Sarah, you have to listen to me. The board, they're voting on the expansion in 6 hours. $1 billion, Sarah. That's not just a hospital. That's the entire regional economy. If you go public with this now, they won't just fire you. They'll neutralize the threat. That's what they called it in the memo I saw. Neutralization. I don't care about the economy, Sarah hissed, her voice cracking the stillness of the park. They're harvesting people, Mark. They're treating patients like spare parts bins. How can you even talk about a vote? Because I want you to live. Mark stepped closer, his eyes pleading. Just give it to me. Let me take it to the board's legal counsel. They can handle it internally. We can move away, Sarah. We can go to Boston, start over. Please? Sarah looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the fear that had hollowed him out. He wasn't a villain, but he was a man who believed the truth was a luxury they couldn't afford. She stepped back, tucking the drive back into her pocket. Internal counsel is Vance's brother-in-law, Mark, she said, her voice turning cold and precise. 1, 2, 3. That's the number of lies you just told me. I'm not giving you anything. She turned toward her car, her mind already mapping the route to a safe house she'd heard the older nurses whisper about. She didn't see the black SUV until its headlights flared to life behind her, twin suns of predatory light that blinded her in the rearview mirror. The chase began on the winding back roads of suburban Connecticut, the tires of Sarah's small hatchback screaming as she took the corners. The SUV was a shadow, a massive, unyielding weight that slammed into her rear bumper with a bone-jarring thud. The steering wheel bucked in her hands, the vibration traveling up her arms and making her teeth ache. She surged onto a stretch of road currently under construction, the pavement giving way to raw earth and jagged rebar. The air here was thick with the smell of diesel and wet concrete. A pneumatic drill sat idle in the distance, a silent sentinel in the dark. Sarah saw her chance, a narrow gap between two massive yellow excavators, barely wide enough for her car. She floored the accelerator, her vision narrowing to the sliver of space. The SUV roared behind her, the driver clearly intending to ram her into the steel teeth of the machinery. She gripped the wheel, counting the seconds. 3, 2, 1. She swerved, the side of her car scraping against the excavator with a shower of sparks that lit up the night like a firework. She squeezed through, the metal of her door groaning as it peeled back. The SUV, too wide and moving too fast, couldn't make the correction. It struck the edge of the machinery, the sound of the impact like a localized explosion. The massive vehicle flipped, a slow-motion arc of glass and steel, and plummeted into a deep, freshly dug trench. Sarah slammed on her brakes, her chest heaving. She watched as the trench, filled with a thick gray soup of wet concrete, swallowed the SUV. The mud hissed as it settled, the headlights of the sunken vehicle glowing like dying embers beneath the surface. Silence returned to the construction site, heavy and absolute. She didn't wait to see if anyone crawled out. She threw the car into gear and vanished into the night. 2 hours later, Sarah sat in the flickering neon light of a roadside motel, her laptop screen the only source of warmth in the room. Her fingers were still shaking, making it difficult to type. But the need for the truth was a physical pressure behind her eyes. She bypassed the hospital's primary encryption, a task she'd practiced a dozen times in her head, and began to peel back the layers of the gray zone files. The data didn't just show negligence. It showed a map. She found the names. Mr. Abraham, Mrs. Gable, a young man named Thomas. All of them had been marked with a red X 48 hours before their deaths. And next to those names were other names. The recipients, a senator, a tech mogul, a real estate developer. The clean record wasn't about statistics. It was a menu. St. Jude's was identifying healthy people with rare blood types or perfect tissue matches. waiting for a minor ailment to bring them through the doors, and then ensuring they never left. It was a state-of-the-art killing field where the harvest was worth more than the human. Sarah's breath hitched as she opened a final subfolder. Subverted Phase 1. Smart decision. Sarah decided to cross-reference the gray zone list with the National Donor Registry. She was a trained nurse. She knew how the system worked. If she could prove that the accidental deaths at St. Jude's perfectly lined up with the emergency needs of the wealthy donors on the VIP floor, she wouldn't just have a scandal. She would have a mathematical certainty of murder. She felt a surge of cold, professional confidence. This was the smoking gun. No judge could ignore a 1-in-a-million statistical impossibility. She began to run the comparison algorithm she'd built, her mind already picturing the look on the district attorney's face when she presented the evidence. Phase 2. False positive. The screen began to fill with green check marks. Match found. Match found. Match found. The data was even more damning than she'd hoped. It wasn't just a few cases. It was dozens. Every single gray zone patient had been a perfect biological key for a waiting lock. Sarah leaned back, a long, shaky breath escaping her lungs. She had them. She had the entire architecture of the slaughterhouse. She felt a brief, soaring moment of victory, a sense that Mr. Abraham might finally get his justice. She reached for her phone to call the one investigative journalist she'd heard was still clean. The crisis was almost over. Phase 3. The crack, she stopped, her thumb hovering over the screen. Something was wrong. She looked at the donor registry she'd accessed, the official government database. A small detail caught her eye. The timestamps on the registry entries were changing. Right in front of her eyes, the names of the donors were being replaced. The senator's name vanished, replaced by a generic string of numbers. The tech mogul's file blinked out of existence. A cold prickle of dread danced across Sarah's skin. She wasn't just watching the data. Someone was watching her watch it. Phase 4. Full collapse. The screen suddenly turned a violent, bleeding red. A single message appeared in the center. Access denied. Credentials revoked. Sarah lunged for the keyboard, her fingers flying, but the keys were dead. A sharp, electronic whine emitted from the laptop, a sound like a dying animal that made her ears ring. Then, the screen went black. She realized with a sickening jolt that her smart move had been the ultimate trap. By accessing the National Registry from her personal laptop, she hadn't gathered evidence. She had signaled her exact location and her level of knowledge to the very system she was trying to expose. The registry wasn't an independent entity. It was part of the same infrastructure Vance controlled. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text message from an unknown number. "We see you, Sarah. Thank you for the map." Her stomach dropped. She hadn't just lost the evidence. She had handed them a digital trail that led straight to her motel room. She looked at the door, the flimsy wooden latch suddenly looking like paper. She had tried to outsmart a machine that owned the very air she breathed, and in doing so, she had pinned herself to the board like a specimen. She wasn't the hunter. She was the next statistical outlier to be removed. Sarah didn't pack. She grabbed her car keys and her medical bag and sprinted for the door, the smell of ozone and burnt plastic from her dead laptop clinging to her clothes. She knew there was one person left she couldn't leave behind. Chloe Smith, a 10-year-old girl with a rare blood type who had been brought in after a hit-and-run that Sarah now knew was no accident. Chloe was the next harvest. Sarah arrived at St. Jude's at 3 a.m., the hospital glowing like a haunted palace against the black Connecticut sky. She didn't use the front entrance. She donned a stained maintenance jumpsuit she'd swiped from the laundry bay and slipped through the service entrance Bill had shown her. The hospital felt different now. Predatory. The high-pitched electronic whine of the server racks in the walls sounded like a predator's hum. She moved through the shadows, her feet silent on the linoleum. She found Chloe in the pediatric ward, a small, pale figure huddled in a bed that looked far too large for her. The girl's eyes were wide, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. 1, 2, 3. Chloe was whispering, her voice a tiny, rhythmic ghost. 4, 5. Sarah felt a sharp pang in her chest. The girl was counting the seconds, just like she did. It was the only way to feel like the world had boundaries. Chloe, Sarah whispered, stepping into the light of the bedside monitor. My name is Sarah. I'm a nurse. I'm here to take you for a walk, okay? The girl looked at her, her gaze cynical and old. They said I'm going to the special room. For the new blood. No, Sarah said, her voice firm. We're going to a different room, a safe one. She lifted the girl, who felt as light as a bundle of dry sticks, and placed her in a laundry cart she'd stashed in the hallway. She covered Chloe with a pile of heavy, damp sheets, the smell of bleach and detergent thick enough to mask the girl's scent. She pushed the cart toward the service wing, her heart a frantic drumbeat. She just had to reach the boiler room, then the loading dock. But as she rounded the corner into the basement corridor, the air grew heavy and hot. The massive, throbbing machinery of the hospital's heart echoed off the low ceilings. A figure stepped out from behind a steam pipe. Dr. Robert Vance stood there, his charcoal suit looking pristine even in the humid, soot-stained air. He wasn't carrying a scalpel. In his hand was a sleek, silver pen, a high-voltage sedative device that glowed with a faint, blue light. You have a very persistent rhythm, Sarah, Vance said, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. But even the best heart eventually grows tired. Sarah shoved the laundry cart into a side alcove, her body a shield between Vance and the child. She's 10 years old, Robert. How much is a 10-year-old's life worth to the board? $1 million? 2? It's not about the money, Vance replied, stepping closer. The blue light of the pen reflected in his predatory eyes. It's about the equilibrium. One girl for the survival of the institution that serves thousands. It's a simple, necessary sacrifice. And unfortunately, you've become a variable we can no longer afford to track. He lunged. Sarah backed away, her heels skidding on the oily floor. She grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher from the wall, the cold metal biting into her palms. She didn't spray him. She swung it, the heavy canister whistling through the air. Vance dodged with a graceful, practiced movement, the sedative pen hissing as it narrowly missed her neck. You're making a noise, Sarah, Vance whispered, his face inches from hers. And we treat infections by removing the source. Sarah saw the laundry chute behind him, a gaping metal maw that led to the disposal bay. It was a desperate one-way trip, but it was the only exit left. She didn't think. She threw the fire extinguisher at Vance's feet, the heavy metal clattering and creating a momentary distraction. And then she threw herself into the chute. The world turned into a blur of cold metal and darkness. She slid down the steep incline, the friction burning through her jumpsuit, until she hit the bottom with a bone-jarring impact. She landed in a mountain of discarded sheets and medical waste. The air here was cloying and sweet, the smell of rotting organic matter rising from the disposal bins. She scrambled to her feet, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and ran for the heavy steel doors of the disposal bay. They were locked. She pounded on the reinforced glass of the small observation window, her voice raw. Help! Someone help! She stopped. A figure was standing on the other side of the glass. Subverted Phase 1. Smart decision. It was Elena Rossi, the investigative journalist Sarah had been trying to reach for days. Elena was a legend, a woman who had taken down governors and pharmaceutical giants. Seeing her there, in the restricted basement of the hospital, felt like a literal act of God. Sarah felt a surge of overwhelming relief. Elena must have followed the trail Sarah left. She was here to document the gray zone, to bring the cameras and the light that would burn this place down. Sarah pressed her hands against the glass, tears of hope stinging her eyes. She had done it. She had survived long enough to hand the story to the one person who could finish it. Phase 2. False positive. Elena looked through the glass, her expression one of deep, maternal concern. She nodded slowly, mouthing the words, "It's okay, Sarah. I'm here. We've got you." She pulled a digital recorder from her bag and held it up, showing Sarah that she was ready to take the testimony. Sarah began to speak, her words tumbling out in a frantic, desperate stream. The names, the harvesting, the clean record policy. Elena recorded every word, her eyes focused and intense. Sarah felt the weight of the last 48 hours begin to lift. The truth was out. The monster was finally going to be seen. Phase 3. The crack. Sarah paused to catch her breath. She watched Elena lower the recorder. The journalist wasn't looking at her anymore. She was looking at something behind Sarah in the shadows of the disposal bay. And she was smiling. Not a smile of victory or comfort, but a sharp, professional smile that never reached her eyes. Elena reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound folder. The same kind of folder Vance used for the board memos. Phase 4. Full collapse. The door to the hallway opened, and Dr. Robert Vance stepped into view. Sarah watched, her world fracturing into 1,000 jagged pieces, as Elena Rossi, the champion of the truth, warmly shook Vance's hand. "She gave me everything, Robert," Elena said, her voice muffled by the glass but perfectly clear in the silence of Sarah's heart. "The recordings are complete. We can frame the narrative as a mental breakdown. The obsessive nurse and her delusions. It'll play perfectly in the Sunday edition." Vance nodded, his hand resting on Elena's shoulder in that same predatory gesture of dominance. "The board will be very pleased with your stewardship of the story, Elena. The expansion will proceed as planned." Elena handed the digital recorder, the one containing Sarah's only testimony, directly to Vance. He tucked it into his breast pocket and adjusted his tie 3 times. Sarah screamed, her fists drumming against the reinforced glass until her knuckles bled. But the sound didn't even make them flinch. The room was soundproof. The bay was a tomb. She realized then that there was no outside to go to. The media, the police, the hospital, they were all part of the same architecture. Elena hadn't come to save her. She had been hired to collect the last of the evidence so it could be destroyed. Sarah was trapped in a locked room with the very people she had tried to expose, and she had just handed them the rope they would use to hang her. They left her there in the dark, the heavy click of the deadbolt echoing like a gunshot. Sarah sat on the floor, the smell of bleach and rot filling her lungs. She looked at her hands, shaking and stained with soot. She had lost the drive, She had lost her ally. She had lost her voice. But then she heard it, a faint, rhythmic thudding from above. 1, 2, 3. Chloe. The girl was still in the alcove. She was still waiting. Sarah's hypervigilance, the quirk that had made her a pariah, suddenly became her only weapon. She didn't look for a key. She looked for the dimensions. She scanned the disposal bay, her eyes finding the gaps in the perfect system. The disposal bay was pressurized to keep the smells from reaching the upper floors. That meant there was a ventilation shaft. And every ventilation shaft in a building this old had to have a manual override for the fire dampers. She found the access panel behind a pile of soiled linens. She didn't have tools, but she had a stethoscope. She used the metal binaurals as a lever, prying the panel open with a screech of protesting steel. She crawled into the narrow, galvanized tunnel, the metal cold and biting against her skin. She moved like a ghost through the veins of the hospital, following the sound of the high-pitched electronic whine. She didn't go for the exit. She went for the master control room. She emerged from a ceiling vent in the heart of the hospital's nervous system, a room filled with glowing monitors and a wall of server racks. Standing at the central console was Deborah Miller, her silver hair shimmering under the fluorescent lights. Deborah was rubbing the smooth stone in her pocket, the click-clack against her wedding ring, a rhythmic, soothing sound. "I knew you'd find a way in, Sarah," Deborah said, not turning around. Her voice was as soft as a lullaby. "You were always my best student. You see the details others miss." "Why, Deborah?" Sarah asked, her voice raspy from the soot. "You taught me that the patient is the only thing that matters." Deborah finally turned, her eyes filled with a terrifying, maternal warmth. "And I was right. But the patient isn't an individual, Sarah. The patient is the system. St. Jude's was dying. We were out of resources, out of time. I lost my own daughter because this hospital didn't have the funding for a simple heart transplant. I decided then that I would never let that happen again. I built a system that ensures the hospital always survives. The gray zone isn't murder, it's resource reallocation. We sacrifice the few to save the many. It's the ultimate act of mercy." "It's not mercy," Sarah spat, stepping toward the console. "It's a slaughterhouse." "Is it?" Deborah asked, her thumb moving over the stone. "Look at the screen, Sarah. Look at the lives we've saved. The children who got the transplants, the parents who went home. Is their joy less valuable than Mr. Abraham's final few months of tremors and pain?" Sarah looked at the monitors, at the clean record statistics that Vance was so proud of. Then she looked at the master clock on the wall, the one with 13 numbers, the extra hour highlighted in red. The hour where the bodies were moved, the hour where the truth was erased. "The truth doesn't have a price," Sarah said. She didn't try to fight Deborah. She didn't try to delete the files. Instead, she reached for the emergency broadcast toggle, the one designed for mass casualty events. "What are you doing?" Deborah's voice lost its soothing edge. "I'm giving the system a checkup," Sarah replied. She bypassed the security codes, the ones she'd memorized by watching Vance's fingers, and linked the gray zone hidden server directly to the hospital's internal network. In an instant, every monitor in the building, the ones in the lobby, the waiting rooms, the nurses' stations, and even the local news feed in the cafeteria, flickered and changed. The clean record vanished. In its place was the live, raw data of the organ ward. The names of the victims, the footage of the black SUVs, the recordings of Vance and Elena Rossi in the basement. The silence that fell over the hospital was absolute. Then, the screaming began. In the lobby, the digital patient status board erupted into a chaotic blur of red text. The grand piano in the corner, playing its hollow mechanical music, suddenly stopped. Sarah watched on the monitors as the police officers in the lobby, the ones who weren't part of the conspiracy, looked up in horror. She saw Vance standing in the surgical theater, his face turning the color of wet ash as his own voice echoed from the speakers. detailing the price of a human kidney. The climax was swift and silent. There were no gunfights, no dramatic chases. The truth was a flood that simply washed the foundation away. The corrupt officers were forced to arrest their own colleagues as the public. The families in the waiting rooms surrounded them, their phones out, recording the end of the clean record. Sarah walked out of the master control room, leaving Deborah Miller sitting in the dark, still rubbing her stone, the sound of it now nothing more than a lonely, meaningless click. She found Chloe in the alcove, the girl still huddled in the laundry cart. "Is it time?" Chloe asked, her voice trembling. Sarah picked her up, holding her close, the warmth of the child's heartbeat at the only thing that mattered. "Yes," Sarah whispered. "It's time to go home." Weeks later, the white walls of St. Jude's were covered in yellow crime scene tape. The experimental wing was a ghost town, the high-tech monitors dark and silent. Sarah walked through the empty hallways one last time to empty her locker. The smell of bleach was gone, replaced by the scent of dust and stagnant air. She stood in front of room 402, the place where Mr. Abraham had died. She realized then that her obsession with counting, her need to map the world, hadn't been about preventing death. It had been about finding the courage to look at it without blinking. Her brother hadn't been lost because she didn't count the steps. He was lost because the world is a place where bad things happen, and no amount of vigilance can change that. But you can choose what you do in the aftermath. She left her stethoscope on the floor of the room, a small silver offering, and walked out into the Connecticut sun. Her new job was a world away from the sterile mathematical cold of St. Jude's. It was a quiet rural hospice, a place of peeling paint and overgrown gardens where the air smelled of lavender and old books. Sarah sat on the porch, holding the hand of an elderly man named Samuel. He was dying, his breath coming in slow, shallow hitches. There were no monitors here, no clean record protocols, just the sound of the wind in the trees and the long golden shadows of the sunset. 1, 2, 3, Samuel whispered, his eyes closed. Sarah smiled, her thumb tracing the lines on his weathered hand. "It's okay, Samuel," she said, her voice a soft, steady anchor. "We have all the time in the world." She didn't count the seconds anymore. She just listened to the heartbeats, each one a unique, messy, beautiful truth. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah Johnson finally stopped counting, knowing that she was exactly where she needed to be. Every heartbeat she heard was real. And for the first time in her life, that was enough.